Hello, and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and today I'm talking about the books I read in March, as well as talking about a few of the movies I watched as well. And now, the movies I watched for book versus movie I don't talk about here because I talk about it in my book versus movie episode. However, the books I read for my book versus movie episodes I do talk about on here because I rank the books I read this month, and so I include those as part of that. But when I talk about them, I will talk about them pretty briefly because I have whole videos dedicated to them, right? So I don't want to just be repeating myself in this video saying things that I already have said in the book versus movie video for it. Anyway, so to start with the movies I watched, last month in February, I watched Triangle of Sadness, which was written and directed by Ruben Ostlund. I loved it, so I wanted to watch more of his movies, so I watched Force Majeure, as well as the American remake Downhill, because Ruben Ostlund, I think he's Swedish. Anyway, Force Majeure I really liked. I would definitely recommend. It is about a couple and their two children who were on a ski trip, and while they were at breakfast, this avalanche starts approaching, and the husband runs off and leaves his wife and child, two children. But then they find out that the avalanche, it was kind of like a false alarm. They were fine. And so now this family just has to deal with what just happened with the husband and their father, And so really well done, great performances. It's a drama with some moments of comedy and some offbeat dark comedy. And yeah, I just really loved it, and it gives you a lot to think about, and I think it would be a good one to watch with others too and to just discuss afterwards. The American remake is called Downhill, and it stars Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And this one I liked well enough. They definitely, they make their changes, including the fact that the main couple are much older, right? Because Ferrell and Dreyfus, they're pushing 60, whereas the couple in the original movie were probably in their mid to late 30s, I would guess. And so I feel like that changes things, just the age difference. And they even make a point of that in Downhill, where she's talking about the situation with this other woman, and this woman who is not married, she's just dating. She's like, oh, it's black and white. If the guy I'm with, if he did that, I would dump him flat, no discussion. There's nothing to talk about. It's simple, black and white, cut and dry, whatever. And Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character is like, how old are you? And the woman is 30. And so just making the point of how it's not as black and white as it might seem. And once you're older and more experienced in life, you realize that things aren't always as cut and dry as it seems, especially when you've been sharing a life with someone for 20 years or something. Then it definitely is more complicated, and it's not as simple as, you did that, so I'm leaving you. There's so much more to the situation. And I was going to make a whole video talking about the differences, and then I just didn't. But ultimately, I would recommend both. I think Force Majeure is definitely the better of the two, but I do think Downhill is worth watching, and it got a lot of hate when it came out because people liked Force Majeure so much better, but I still think it's worth watching ultimately. Anyway, I also watched The Square. This one won the Palme d'Or in 2017, I think. And this one wasn't what I expected. It's more like a series of short stories which are connected because it has the same guy, and it's this museum curator, and so a lot of the stories within this movie deal with him and deal with the pretentious art world basically. And some of the moments, some of the scenes, some of the stories were funny and entertaining, but then others, the image in the poster, that scene was one of the most uncomfortable scenes I have watched in a long time, and it was just it wasn't cringy. It wasn't that kind of uncomfortable, but it was just, maybe a little cringy, but definitely just so uncomfortable. But yeah, and then when it was all done, you're kind of just left being okay. So it's definitely not your conventional plot line where, things, because the plot is kind of, like I said, it's these short stories where they're all kind of isolated, and so it was very unique, very different, not what I was expecting. But it does have some of that offbeat humor that he has in his other movies. And all of his movies are kind of looking at gender roles and looking at the rich and looking at the art world and looking at, just human nature. And so, yeah, it was... I'm trying to decide if I would recommend it. I guess if you're a fan of Ostlund's other movies, then yeah, sure, you should watch The Square, but it was my least favorite of the three, so take that as you will. And then I finally watched Prisoners from 2013, directed by Denis Villeneuve. This has Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, Viola Davis, Terrence Howard, Paul Dano, and it is incredible. I think it might be a 5-star movie. I didn't give it 5 stars on Letterboxd, but I feel like if I watched it a second time, I might bump it up because it was just so good. Roger Deakins does the cinematography and it's very intense. It's not a movie I'd recommend to just anybody because it is a very intense subject matter, but it is so well done, incredible performances, and there is one scene, I mean, there's so many amazing scenes, but there is a scene that happens kind of near the end where it's just been so tense throughout, and then this but this tense scene that's happening and you're just like, oh my gosh, and I was getting teary-eyed in that moment, and it's just like so intense, so well done. It was fantastic. Highly recommend this one. If you have not seen it, go watch it. It is a mystery, I guess. Yeah, a mystery. But it's incredible. Highly recommend. And then the last movie I want to talk about is Decision to Leave. This is a Korean film that came out last year, and a lot of like film buffs talk about this movie as if it is just the best thing ever. And I get like it has the symbolism within it is really well done with the mountains and the sea and everything, but it just wasn't what I expected. Like it ended up just being about this like toxic romance basically. And I mean, it was well done, but I guess because of all the hype around it, I was expecting something more. And so at the end of the day, I was just kind of like, is that all? So I was a little disappointed, a little let down. And I have a brother who speaks Korean, and I thought of texting him about it and recommending it. But then I was like, did I even like it enough to recommend it to him? So I didn't end up recommending it to him. But yeah, I don't know. It was all right. But for the way people were talking about it on YouTube and on Letterboxd and whatever, acting like it was just the best thing ever. So ultimately I was disappointed. So yeah, anyway. So that wraps it up for the movies I wanted to touch on that I have watched. It seems like there was like another movie I should talk about. Also, I watched the sequel to The Phantom of the Opera, which I don't know if you know there was a sequel, but it is based on a book, so I might do a book versus movie. The book has horrible reviews, so it wouldn't be very good, and the sequel I definitely have some complaints with, but so yeah, I'll save my thoughts for that in case I do a video for that in the future. Oh, also I did watch Gerald's Game, which I didn't end up filming a book versus movie for that, even though I did watch the movie, and I did love the movie. I thought it was so well done. I love the performances. I love, the character of Jessie has conversations in her head in the book, and I love the way they showed that in the movie. Really good. The ending sucked, but the ending sucks with the book too, so I'm actually going to talk about that here in this video when I get to Gerald's Game, since I don't have an actual book versus movie video for that one. But yeah, so let's get right to the books. I read 11 books this month, by the way, and I will be talking about them from my least favorite to my favorite. But honestly, none of these books I hated. So number 11 is Velvet Was the Night by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This one is by the same author as Mexican Gothic, which I loved. But this book, however, it was just the one that was available on Libby. That's why I chose it. And ultimately, it was fine. When I was looking at my list of books I read in order to rank them, I saw this one and I was just like, wow, I totally forgot I even read that book because it was just a forgettable read. It wasn't memorable. So it wasn't bad, but there was nothing about it that stands out in my mind, and it was just kind of fine. Ultimately, I think the most interesting part is the historical aspect, because it takes place in Mexico in the 1970s and dealing with some historical events that really did happen, and then she mixes in some fiction within that. So the historical aspect was interesting, but aside from that, I was just kind of it was okay. Didn't love it, didn't hate it. Isn't one that I will remember down the road, Number 10 is The Mist by Stephen King. This is a novella, and this one I feel similar to with Velvet is the Night, where it was just kind of it was fine. When I was reading it, I wasn't whoa, so invested in the story. I was kind of just reading it. It wasn't this in-depth experience. So it also just wasn't what I expected either. What happens with the mist, I didn't expect that. And so it wasn't as creepy as I thought it might be. And it was just kind of underwhelming, I guess, ultimately. It was fine. But it wasn't one I would recommend. But it isn't one that I hated either. It just it was okay. I do have a book versus movie for this one coming out, though, at the end of the month. And then number 9, Gerald's Game by Stephen King. I have 3 Stephen King ones on here, by the way. But Gerald's Game, so this one is about a woman who is handcuffed to a bed and her husband dies, and so she's trying to figure out how to survive because she's basically stranded. And so this whole book feels like Stephen King playing the game Can I?, which is talked about in Misery with Paul Sheldon, because Paul Sheldon talks about when he's a kid, the teacher would play a game where she would tell them a character who's in this impossible situation, and they need to try to figure out how to get the character out of that situation situation in a realistic way. And that's basically what this whole book is trying to figure out like, okay, well, she needs to drink water, right? Because that's the most important thing. So how can we get her to get some water? And how can we get this to happen? And how can this happen? And so it's like he's just playing that game throughout this book, which I really enjoyed and I thought it was well done. However, the ending is so out of place. Suddenly we take this turn and it's just like, wait, what? Why are we even talking about this? And it's like he had this idea for this other story, and instead of turning it into a novella, he just tacked it on to the end of Gerald's game. And it just felt so out of place and so random, and it really dragged the story down once we took that turn. So yeah, it was pretty just so random. And then also the reason though I didn't do a book versus movie for this, I actually did film a book versus movie, but then I didn't end up posting it or anything because I just didn't think it was well done. And the topic discussed in this book, like the main overarching topic, which is something that happened to Jesse on the day of the eclipse, which this book is connected to Dolores Claiborne because both of them have some similar themes, but then they both have an event that takes place on the eclipse, on the day of an eclipse. But yeah, the topic that would need to be talked about at length for this episode was just one that I am not comfortable talking about. And so I feel like in that video, you could just tell that I was just uncomfortable and trying to discuss it while also kind of like just skirting the edges of it. And it just wasn't a good video. And so I decided to not post it, and I decided that I just wouldn't film a book versus movie since it's just not a topic I want to talk about. So yeah, so that's why I didn't do that. But the movie keeps the same ending as the book though. Like the movie was so well done and I really liked it. And like I said, the performances were fantastic. And then we have like these different versions of herself and her husband she is talking to. And I thought it was just so well done. But they kept the same ending. Like this was your chance, Mike Flanagan, to get rid of that terrible Stephen King ending and put a better, appropriate, more fitting, more satisfying ending here. But instead he did the same ending the book does. And it was just, again, so out of place. And in the movie, it was also just so cheesy too, the way it happens. And it was just so bad. So dumb. And yeah, so that's Gerald's game. But moving on to French Braid by Anne Tyler. This one is like about a family through the course of decades, and we get perspectives through each of the family members, the parents and the children. And it was definitely giving me like, oh, sorry, I just realized this East of Eden book is up here. Well, whatever, I'll just leave it. Anyway, French Braid was giving me like We Were the Mulvaneys vibes, which is by Joyce Carol Oates. We Were the Mulvaneys, I loved. 5 stars, I would recommend that. But it was kind of similar, whereas We Were the Mulvaneys, though, it did have like a specific event that happens with this family, and we see how they are formed and changed by this event. Whereas French Braid doesn't have that. There's not one big event. It's just kind of life just happens, and it's just normal life events, you know? And so in some ways I liked that there wasn't like this main event changed all of them. Instead, it's just seeing how they changed and progressed through the decades just with normal life. So I did really like it. I read it pretty quickly because I was definitely invested and interested. And yeah, I enjoyed it and I would recommend it. And I am interested in reading more by Anne Tyler. And I love books like this that span over decades. And I love books that look into the familial relationships. So yeah, highly recommend. Next up, this might be controversial for how low this is on my list, but number 7 is The Shawshank Redemption, or Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption. This one I liked. I think I gave it 4 stars. So all of these books I'm getting into now are ones that I really liked. But this one, it just was like, it wasn't groundbreaking and it wasn't one that will like stick with me. In fact, I read this in 2020 and it didn't make much of an impact on me then. And so rereading it now, I felt kind of the same, where it's like, yeah, it's a good story and it's a good message about hope and friendship and, you know, inspiration and all that good stuff. But it just wasn't one that like got me down deep. It was just kind of, I don't want to call it surface level because that makes it sound worse, I guess, because there is more to it, but I liked it. It just wasn't anything like incredible in my eyes, personally. I know a lot of people love it though, and I'm not going to hate on anyone who loves it. I think it's a good choice to say is your favorite book or whatever, but yeah. Anyway, that's number 7 for me, and I do have a book versus movie for this coming out the first Wednesday in April. And then next up is number 6, Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. So I have never read H.P. Lovecraft until now, and someone recommended this one on my video for the weirdest books I've read. Of course, H.P. Lovecraft is notorious for being weird, and yeah, I really like this one a lot. I've heard other authors I like who do like the cosmic horror and like the weird nature horror. I don't know if that's a thing, but when it involves nature and humans and whatever, I've heard them compare it to H.P. Lovecraft, but I had never read him, so I didn't know. But now that I have read him in this particular story, I can definitely see how other people were inspired by him. And I definitely want to read more by him. And it's interesting too, because H.P. Lovecraft isn't like infamous for his fear of immigrants and his dislike for anybody different than him. And so you see that come through in this book. And so it's just really interesting how his own personal fears and prejudices show through in this story, but it's done so well. And yeah, and I really liked this one, and I would definitely recommend it, especially if you're into the cosmic horror, you know, Jeff Vandermeer, whatever. I'm trying to think of other authors like that. Anyway, those type of books. If you haven't read H.P. Lovecraft yet, you should, because a lot of people are inspired by him. And there's a reason why even his last name, like Lovecraftian, like that's an adverb, or that's an adjective that is used to describe certain types of books, because he had just such this distinct style. Number 5, this one seems kind of high. Like, part of me, I originally had this lower, but then I bumped it up, and now I'm like, maybe it's too high. But that is One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This one, the movie comes out in April, so I will have a book versus movie. I'm very excited for the movie because I liked this book so much. There were certain moments within this book that I just absolutely loved, and like different conversations that are had where like the dialogue just rings true, right? And it just feels so real and relatable, and it also just is a good message too. And it's about a woman who is married, and then her husband disappears and they think he's dead, and then she gets engaged to this other guy, and then 3 years later they find out her husband is still alive. And so now she's like, do I get with my high school sweetheart who I assume dead, or do I stay with this guy that I'm now engaged to? And so she's just in this predicament. And at times the story was cheesy and it was predictable, and it was just, you know, not necessarily realistic, but nonetheless I really enjoyed reading this one. And like I said, even though the situation is like so preposterous and like, when does this ever happen in real life? Even so, there were certain discussions and arguments and conversations where it just felt real, right? Even if I haven't had a conversation exactly like that, I could relate to a conversation similar to that, if that makes sense. So I was surprised how much I like this one. I definitely want to read more by her now. She's very popular on Bookstagram and BookTube, so I get it, because I really did like this one quite a lot. And then number 4 on the list is Paris, the Paris Hilton memoir. I have a whole video talking about this one, so if you want to hear more, you can check that out. But yeah, I was very pleasantly surprised with this one. Like, I talk about this on Instagram, but some celebrity memoirs, it feels like they're just writing a book because they're famous, and like that was their only purpose, was just to write about their life, and they didn't have like a reason for writing it beyond that, aside from the money they can make from telling some other story. Where she definitely had a motivation and a purpose to this book, and it was also just very empowering, and you also see into her as a person, which I didn't know anything about her really. And so she has overcome a lot of trauma, and so just hearing her story, and she has so much grace and so much grace towards people like in her life, while also standing up for herself and calling people out who, you know, mistreated her in the past, you know. And so it was a good balance there. But yeah, I would definitely recommend this one. It was really good. I have a new admiration for Paris Hilton, and if you want to hear more about it, you can check out my 20-minute video where I talk about this book. Number 3 is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfeld. I just ordered a first edition copy of this book, so it will be arriving, you know, in like a week. But I think the cover is so cool. And this book itself, it was amazing. I already want to read it a second time, but it is about a woman whose wife goes on this deep sea expedition, and then she comes back changed. And we go back and forth between hearing the perspective of the wife who is here right now dealing with her wife who has changed, but then we also hear the perspective of the woman who went on the expedition, and like it's her journal entries from when they're down there and what they experienced and why she came back changed. So kind of along the Shadow over Innsmouth, you know, line, this is kind of that cosmic weird nature horror, I guess. And it is just so well done. And it's also just like so beautiful and so tragic. And it's just so well written and so captivating. And this is another one that I finished within like a day or two, because I just could not put it down. I wanted to find out what was going to happen, what did happen. And I was just so invested in these characters, and I felt so connected to them. And it was just incredible, and I absolutely loved it. And in fact, I'm currently reading another book by this author. It is a series of short stories. So that is one you will hear me talk about next month. I feel like I'm talking fast. I apologize. But anyway, number 2 on this list is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. This was tough. Having it number 2, like, it was tough, because I did want to put it as number one, but I have a video coming out for this. I'm in the middle of editing it. It's going to be a long one. It's probably going to be around an hour. Filming was like an hour and 15 minutes, but after editing, it'll probably come down to like an hour. So I'm not going to talk too much about it because I already talked a lot about it. I filmed that video earlier today, by the way, so I've already done a lot of talking, but anyhow, love this epic family saga. Spans the course of decades. It is, parallels the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Eden. And yes, the symbolism is very obvious. It's very heavy-handed. He's not like trying to be secretive here, but it's so well done. Amazing characters, and can be intimidating because it is such a big book. But believe me, once you get to chapter 2, the ball gets rolling and you just get so invested in these characters. And we have Kathy Ames, who is just incredible. And if you're a fan of Gillian Flynn, you should read this book just to read about Kathy Ames, because I was definitely getting some strong Gillian Flynn vibes. I won't name what book or what character, but just know Gillian Flynn has a character that was reminding me of Kathy Ames. So yeah, highly recommend that one. It's fantastic. And I kind of have my nitpicks about it as far as like it being thought-provoking, because there's sometimes where it seems like maybe Steinbeck thought he was like, I don't know, like he thinks he's being so deep, but then it's like, is this really that big of a deal to be talking about this? I don't know. Maybe I'm being, like I said, too nitpicky about it, but nonetheless, it is thought-provoking and it is very well done. And yeah, it's amazing. And I love John Steinbeck. His writing is incredible. If you have not read anything by him, you definitely should. Which, if you've never read John Steinbeck, I think I would recommend to start with The Red Pony, actually, which is a series of 4 short stories. Either that or The Long Valley, which is also a series of short stories. But yeah, I love John Steinbeck. This book was amazing. I really wanted to put it at number 1, but The Color Purple, it was just fantastic. I read it twice, back to back, basically. I have my book versus movie out for it, so you can hear me talk more about it, but I just love the character arcs we get in this story, and I love the messages and the love between various characters and their relationships and how they change through the years, and the relationship Celie has with God and her spirituality and how that changes and how she grows and progresses as a person, and how it was just so incredible. And I was just so caught up in these characters and in this story. And I don't want to get into spoilers, but there's a part which I'm trying to talk about it without getting into spoilers, but there's just something that happens. I'm not even going to say it because I feel like I can't say it without spoiling it. But anyway, it's just fantastic. And it just hit me so much on an emotional level. And, this book has so much hype, and now I get it. Highly, highly recommend. It covers tough topics, and yet it doesn't leave you like feeling heavy and being like, wow, like that was intense. Like it actually leaves you feeling uplifted, despite the heavy topics covered. And yeah, I just love it. And it gives you a lot to think about, a lot to talk about, and a lot to dwell on. And honestly, there's some things in this which are like things that I'm just going to remember forever and be like, wow, like that was so amazing. Kind of similar to Anne of Green Gables in some ways, where Anne of Green Gables had some passages where it's just stuck with me for years because I'm like, wow, like it just changed the way I think in a way, So it really impacted me on a deep level in that way. So I had to put this as number 1. It's amazing. If you have not read it, you definitely should. It's not very long. It's like 250 pages, maybe 300, but it's written in a way that makes it easy to read and a pretty quick read. But despite being a quick read, there is just so much to this book. That brings me to best book of 2023. My current champion is spoiler alert, The Hero Dies. So now which one wins? Does spoiler alert continue being number 1, or does The Color Purple beat out spoiler alert? And I already know The Color Purple does beat out spoiler alert. This is the new 2023 champion. Having said that, spoiler alert is fantastic. And that is another one that also just hit me on such a personal, deep level. I mean, personal, I have not been in the situation that he is in this book. So I don't mean personal as in like I could relate necessarily in that sense, but it just really got to me, And it's funny, but tragic and beautiful and sad. Kind of the way The Color Purple is too, because The Color Purple does have some humor in it as well. So I would definitely highly recommend spoiler alert. I'm kind of sad to see it dethroned because it is fantastic. You should definitely read it. Highly, highly, highly recommend spoiler alert. But we now move on to The Color Purple, and that is the new champion. And yeah, so we will see if it remains the champion. It will be interesting to see if it lasts the whole rest of this year, because that would definitely be impressive. But yeah, I guess we'll just have to see. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this reading wrap-up video. Let me know if you have read any of these books down below. Let me know if you have seen any of the movies that I talked about earlier. I do want to watch Babylon. I keep putting that off because it's like 3 hours, but I do want to watch that. And then next month, there's a few different movies in theaters that are coming out that I definitely want to be seeing. So maybe I'll have some theater releases to be talking about at the end of my April video. And then I didn't even talk about the Oscars though, by the way, which I could just go on a whole nother tangent about that because I love that Everything Everywhere won Best Picture. It deserves that. There were other Oscars though where it was kind of like, really? Best Supporting Actress, Jamie Lee Curtis. Like, really? That one was so annoying. And I think there's a lot of people that are annoyed by that one. Like, it should have been Carrie Condon or Angelica. Now I can't remember her name, the Black Panther lady. So yeah, Jamie Lee Curtis winning, or even like Stephanie Hsu from Everything Everywhere. Even her would have been better than Jamie Lee Curtis. But also Brendan Fraser, I'm happy for him. And I know everyone was like, oh, it's either going to be Brendan Fraser or Austin Butler. But I was realizing, like, what about Colin Farrell? People are crazy over Brendan Fraser because it's his comeback story and his first time in Hollywood in so long, and he has this incredible role. But like, what about Colin Farrell? He's been steadily putting out amazing performances for years now, and he still hasn't won an Oscar. So why aren't people cheering for him to win? Just because he doesn't have a comeback story? Like, instead, he's just been steadily working. Like, why aren't we praising that, you know? So yeah, I feel like Colin Farrell should have received a bit more love for his role. But anyway, Brendan Fraser winning, I guess, was fine. I'm not upset about it, but I'm just kind of like, okay. But anyway, yeah, so that wraps it up for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Join my Patreon if you want to receive exclusive monthly content. I release one bonus video a month on Patreon, so you also take part in monthly polls. I also post my book versus movie schedule on Patreon as well. And yeah, thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Bye.